Trade Union Federation Saftu calls for the resignation of the Eskom CEO, Ruyter, Minister of Public Enterprises Pravin Gordan, and President Cyril Ramaphosa to resign amid severe electricity cuts across the country. The Federation says the entire cabinet has done little to stop load shedding for 15 years. For more on this, we're joined in studio by Trevor Shaku, Saftu Spokesperson. Very good evening to you. Thanks for coming in, Trevor. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having us.
You've reiterated the call for Eskom CEO Ruyter to go. But you've taken it even further, saying that the government officials supporting him must also go. That includes Minister Pravin Gordan and President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yes, we think it's only befitting that government takes measures on the people it deploys in the state-owned enterprises. And Eskom, as one of those SOEs, has been run down by this particular executive, but also, I think, previous executives before him. But it is only important at this moment to stress that he must resign because he's failing to stabilize the fleet of Eskom and provide uninterrupted electricity to our people. Now, in the context of that, you are going to have to look at the issues related to maintenance, issues related to ensuring that there is an uninterrupted supply of coal, which is also good for those power stations because we've had over time that there are heavy metals which are involved in those particular stations and which are leading to the trips and the breaks in those particular stations. But you can't let it at that particular level. You are going to have to drag that to its logical conclusion because that is not just a question of Eskom's crisis at this current moment. This crisis has been happening for over 15 years now. Yeah. And the rate that only came in 2019. So if we drag this to where it came from and to its logical conclusion, we can only decide that and conclude that even the Minister of Enterprises, Public Enterprises, the President, the Cabinet, but also the African National Congress must resign.
It's been a crisis that has continued for well over a decade. What do you make of the notion that some experts within the space have said that the current management inherited a disastrous situation and that calling for the resignation of Ruyter would mean that perhaps whoever steps in, 10 CEOs over 10 years, whoever steps in would have to take another year to go back and learn and understand what the situation is at Eskom, further delaying and exacerbating the problem?
Starting with the Ruyter, when he entered Eskom in 2019, he announced that within 6 months he would have dealt with maintenance of the Eskom fleet at the time. He has failed, and we are well over 3 years now. And he's still failing to actually ensure and deliver the maintenance of those particular stations. But yes, people have argued in the past that Eskom's problems have been run down before and you're not going to fix them overnight. But we think that other experts, including even former leaders of that particular entity, have come out in public to say that the fleet is not as old as they say. It still can run for over 30 to 40 years to come. And as a result, it's just a question of maintenance. So why is he failing to maintain the existing fleet? So it is in that context that we are calling for him to resign. But secondly, I think it is important to point out that a person who comes in, first and foremost, must stabilize the fleet, but also look at other renewable sources of energy to connect to the grid, because that is going to be important, especially in the coming period where we're also struggling with climate change and the weather, which is actually putting people's lives at risk as a result of greenhouse emissions. So Eskom has to also invest in renewable energy sources to ensure that it adds them to the grid. And this excludes, of course, the process of independent power producers, because we reject them holistically, because we think that the energy provision in this country must not be privatized.
What about the new Eskom board? We learned that to give them some time so that they could find their feet and come up with something solid. What's your take there?
We don't think they will come up with anything that stabilizes that particular entity, especially because some of the board members appointed to that board have interest in enterprises, private enterprises, which are dealing in electricity generation. And of course, some of them, I'm sure, would be contesting for the bids in the tendering, which are taking place at the current moment in the renewable energy independent power producer program, which is taking place. The chairman in particular has been leading, who's from Nedbank. Nedbank was involved in investing in some of independent power producers. In fact, most of the independent power producers which are locally owned are financed by these particular banks. So we are worried because this is a problem for us, that you put people in the board who would merely accelerate the privatization of energy provision by introducing and accelerating the program of procuring energy from independent power producers. So that is a serious problem for us, and we do not think that they are going to stabilize this, except, in our view, to create further crisis which would only legitimize the route towards privatization. And at this current moment, with this load shedding, where, for instance, a city as Johannesburg is already experiencing 12 hours of load shedding, you realize that people are shocked and would want anything to replace this particular problem. And in this instance, you can utilize, therefore, this as a shock doctrine to tell the people that, you see, the Eskom publicly owned is failing to deliver electricity to you. Therefore, you've got to indeed accept whatever is coming your way to stabilize the grid and provide uninterrupted electricity. And in this case, the independent power producers have been provided as an alternative. And that worries us most, because we are for public ownership of energy provision.
Apartheid spatial classification is also one of your bones of contention when it comes to Andre de Ruyter.
So, you know, Eskom's load shedding program is to ensure that there is load reduction, but load reduction at the standardized process, or at the standardized tempo, where everybody in the country is subjected to a certain hours of power cuts per day. But the load reduction we're talking of is actually continuing even beyond the normal load shedding you would all experience in the country. So certain areas, especially black working class areas, like your townships and villages, are the ones which are targeted for this. And a study from University of Johannesburg has actually shown that, shown that this happens mostly, for instance, in your Soweto, in your other villages in rural areas, but also they've termed this energy resistance. So why should load reduction target certain areas where certain people of certain color, but also of certain class background, are residing, where the leafy suburbs are not affected by such load reduction? So we have a problem with that particular form of power cuts, which of course is aimed at reducing the weight on Eskom, but why should it target certain areas? We think that if there is a need for load reduction, it must target everyone in the country, and it should not be restricted to certain areas and classified for certain areas which are occupied by certain social classes.
So how are you going to ventilate this? I mean, you've made this call, you're reiterating it, also including government. You know, how are you going to ensure that your voice is heard?
On the 18th of November, we started our pickets by Megawatt Park in Sunning Hill. We picketed because we felt that the issuing of statements does not come with any solutions. We are going to have to pressure government to ensure, first and foremost, that to stabilize the fleet, it deals with the firing or the dismissal of the executive, which currently is managing that. But secondly, you are going to have to mobilize the entirety of the working class movements in communities and trade unions, organized labor, to ensure that they begin a protracted struggle where they fight against power cuts, but most importantly fight to ensure that Eskom is able to hire people who are capable of ensuring that they stabilize the fleet, provide electricity uninterruptedly, but also put Eskom on a path towards renewable energy sources, because currently that particular space is dominated by the independent power producers, although we saw something happening in the past few weeks with Komati. But what is important here is that Eskom must be able to champion that particular project, and it should not be left in the hands of the independent power producers alone.
Yeah, you speak about how black communities have been marginalized as a result of the rolling blackouts. What is the bigger impact in your view, and how it affects the working class?
It affects the working class in many, many ways. And in our statement, we actually say that this is a it disrupts social lives. So firstly, just at the basic level, what you see in those communities that small businesses are not able to operate properly when there are power cuts. But secondly, working class households are not able to cope in that particular situation because, one, burglary and theft increases when these particular thugs take cover in the darkness of load shedding. But secondly, you also have problems whereby constant power cuts cause damages to refrigerators of our people. And at this particular period, December, the festive season, where they're involved in stockfell, hot groceries, put them in those particular fridges, only for them to be broken, you'll realize that eventually they've damaged the food which had been bought through these stockfalls to ensure that they alleviate the problem of cost of living at the current moment, because the little, the meager wages which workers are getting at the current moment have to buy Christmas clothes for children, have to buy food. But if you have hot food for the December period, but also extending into January, you are going to have problem if your refrigerators begin to break and you begin to experience spoiling or rotting of your food in any manner. So that is a serious problem, and it affects our working people at the basic level. And we think these are issues which ought to be dealt with. But even at the level of corporates, these corporates, whenever they experience these kinds of cuts, and I've seen in the city press, they show that your Spar and many other retailers experience losses in terms of billions, because in addition to the budget they would have had on electricity, they would have to budget or put aside another money to procure your petrol or your diesel to ensure that they power their generators to continue business. Yeah. The cost or the extra cost of that actually are absorbed by retrenchments, because these particular retailers all the time want to make profits. And in order to make profits, they have to reduce cost of production. And the cost of production are reduced through retrenchments, especially in the context of load shedding. So this thing affects the working class people in many ways.
Have you put any time frames on your calls?
We don't have any time frame, because it also depends on the power of our call to the working class communities, which we interact with in the Working Class Summit. That power, if it gains traction and these organizations begin to pick it up very seriously, we will be able to launch that protracted struggle. But if we begin or continue to speak and write without real action, I don't think government will even be threatened by any of our calls. So we are going to have to mobilize, and that is the reason why we identify 2023 as a year which we should accelerate our struggle. We should ensure that we beef up the struggle which we have started, for instance, this year or even previously. But we have got to ensure that whatever we're doing, we double it. Because without any struggle, we do not think that we are going to make any concrete gains out of this.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for talking to us.